Welcome to Geopolitical Outcomes. As a former naval intelligence officer, my goal is to leverage my experience and training to gain insight in geopolitics and global affairs. In this video, we'll break down the trends and contradictions that could ultimately lead to the collapse of Beijing's One China policy over Taiwan. The Taiwan Strait, dubbed by The Economist magazine as the most dangerous place in the world, is currently on the brink of crisis. In April 2025, tensions in the region reached a perilous new high as the Chinese military launched a massive live-fire exercise called Straight Thunder 2025 Alpha, which encircled Taiwan. At the center of this activity was a Shandong carrier strike group, which maneuvered as close as 24 nautical miles to the Taiwan coast. Also participating were elements of the People's Liberation Army Air Force, Rocket Force, Army, and Coast Guard, who all acted in a coordinated multi-domain approach which simulated activities in accordance with a full-on invasion of Taiwan to include a naval blockade, attacks on critical infrastructure, and seizures of territory. Concurrent with this exercise was a cartoon posted by the Chinese Eastern Theater Command depicting Taiwan's President William Lai as a parasite being roasted over open flame. The cartoon used unflattering metaphors to accuse Lai of colluding with foreign powers, perverting democracy, and stirring chaos, amongst other things. In response, the Taiwanese Foreign Ministry condemned the military drills, saying China had once again challenged a rules-based international order and unilaterally and seriously undermined the peace and stability of the Taiwan Strait and the region. The drills appear to be in response to Lai's recent remarks calling China a foreign hostile force. But cross-strait tensions have been on the rise when last February the U.S. State Department quietly removed a decades-old statement from its website stating that we do not support Taiwanese independence. Washington brushed it off as a routine update. Beijing, however, saw it as a dangerous provocation, one that undermines the fragile status quo and pushes the world closer towards war. China has long maintained that a formal declaration of Taiwanese independence is a red line, one that the PRC will prevent at all costs, including military action. Add to this that tensions were also elevated early this year following the transit of 1 Canadian and 2 American warships through the Taiwan Strait. The US and its allies maintain that these are international waters, critical for global trade, carrying 44% of the world's maritime commerce. But China claims the strait as its own sovereign territory, fueling repeated confrontations at sea and in the air. Making matters worse, Taiwan's newly elected president, William Lai, is seen by Beijing as a direct threat due to his independence-leaning stance. In response to his election last year, China staged 2 large-scale military drills simulating a full blockade of the island, which serves as a chilling rehearsal for potential war. Admiral Samuel Paparo, commander of U.S. Indo-Pacific Command, warns that these exercises could serve as a cover for an actual attack, similar to how Russia masked its invasion of Ukraine with military drills. At the heart of this crisis lies the One China policy, a decades-old doctrine that has left Taiwan's diplomatic status in limbo. Beijing insists that Taiwan is an inseparable part of China, a claim that much of the international community tentatively acknowledges. But among Taiwan's 23 million people, repeated polls show that they do not want to be part of China. And a 2023 Taiwanese Public Opinion Foundation poll showed that nearly half of the respondents supported a formal declaration of independence, which could prompt China to take military action. The conflict over Taiwan wouldn't remain a regional skirmish. It would likely draw in the US, Japan, Australia, the Philippines, and other global powers into the conflict, with devastating repercussions for the world order. The Taiwan Strait isn't just a geopolitical flashpoint. It may well be the fault line for the next world war. The One China policy stems from the Chinese Civil War, which more or less occurred from 1927 to 1949, when the Chinese nationalists or Kuomintang lost control of the mainland to the communists and then fled to Taiwan. Following this, the nationalists in Taiwan intended to one day cross the Taiwan Strait and retake the Chinese mainland, while the Chinese communists sought to one day invade Taiwan and quell the nationalist forces once and for all. Kind of like in the movie Highlander, there can be only one. Both the nationalists in Taipei and the communists in Beijing claim to be the one and only legitimate government for all of China, to include Taiwan. And for the next few decades, both sides maintained a wartime footing with the intention to invade each other. Without going too much into the weeds on their respective histories, over time, the prospect of retaking the Chinese mainland by the Taiwanese became increasingly unrealistic as China's population and military grew to dwarf that of Taiwan. At the same time, the international community gradually came to recognize Beijing as the legitimate government of all of China, and eventually the Taiwanese just let it go. They had better things to focus on, like developing a vibrant economy, a democratic government, and their own sense of identity. Common sense would dictate that both sides would go their separate ways, and that would be the end of the story. But as is usually the case with geopolitics, it was not that simple. As Beijing continues to threaten the much smaller Taiwan with military force, should they declare a formal end to the Chinese Civil War and independence from China. I will go over later what some of Beijing's reasons for this are. However, this situation puts Taiwan in an uncomfortable spot diplomatically, as it can neither be recognized as the legitimate government of China, nor another state. Essentially, Taiwan exists in a state of diplomatic purgatory imposed by Beijing. While not officially recognized diplomatically by most countries, unofficially Taiwan is. For example, in 1979, the United States closed its embassy in Taipei to appease Beijing, only to immediately afterwards open up the American Institute of Taiwan, which is essentially the same thing under a different name. And many other nations have a diplomatic presence in Taiwan under the same model. So despite the awkward position the One China policy put Taiwan in, the island nation sought to improve relations with Beijing, starting in the early 90s. The One China policy began to gain traction as Taipei and Beijing reached a vague understanding called the 1992 Consensus, whereby both agreed that there was only one China, but they'd never settled on who that was. So for Taipei, they still claimed that they were the only true government of all of China, and Beijing claimed the same on their end. For Taiwan, this was a symbolic gesture, as the dream of reclaiming the mainland was long gone, but business interests hoped to establish economic ties with the Chinese economy that was growing by 13% annually and had the world's largest domestic market by population. For years following this, relations improved as both economies grew and became integrated. Talks of peaceful unification, as they saw a path towards absorbing Taiwan without force. Then came the Sunflower Protest movement of 2014. Where student protesters accused Taiwan's Kuomintang-led government of selling out by illegally securing secretive trade deals with China, which allegedly had no benefit to the country and hurt Taiwanese workers. This movement helped completely reshape politics in Taiwan, removing the longtime incumbent Kuomintang government in favor of the China skeptic, pro-independence Democratic Progressive Party, or DPP, to victory in 2016. This new party rejected the 1992 Consensus outright. Meanwhile, Xi Jinping, who has been in power in Beijing since 2012, had no patience for Taiwan's messy democracy. His response? Military intimidation, threats, and economic pressure. However, this succeeded in only pushing the Taiwanese electorate further away from China politically. Following this were pro-democracy protests in Hong Kong. For a little background, the British handed Hong Kong over to China in 1997 under the condition that Hong Kong would receive autonomy under English common law for the next 50 years, under the one country, two systems premise. But under Xi, those freedoms were continually chipped away and violated. For example, a new extradition law would allow Hong Kongers to be extradited to China as criminals for exercising their freedom of speech. Hong Kongers saw this as an inflection point where they would soon lose their freedoms if they didn't act. This prompted massive street protests, followed by Beijing's subsequent crackdowns, sweeping security laws, and the jailing of activists like billionaire Jimmy Lai. Understandably, this chain of events shattered any trust the Taiwanese had in Beijing's promises. Meanwhile, China's appeal continued to fade. Draconian COVID-19 lockdowns trapped millions in their homes. The economy faltered, with growth slowing and foreign investment fleeing. For example, even top business leaders weren't safe, as Jack Ma's disappearance from public view was a warning to others. China's strategy backfired. Once seen as an emerging partner, it was now viewed as an authoritarian threat. Therefore, the continued popularity of the DPP and President William Lai's election in 2024 can be seen as a direct response to China's aggression, as his Democratic Progressive Party, or DPP, outright rejects the One China principle, and his administration will pursue policies that strengthen Taiwan's independence. Beijing, in turn, sees this as a provocation. And so a feedback loop begins as China retaliates with more military exercises, more threats, more diplomatic pressure. Each escalation further alienates Taiwan, driving further against the idea of unification. The harder China squeezes, the more Taiwan slips through his fingers. But Taiwan and China are at an impasse. Taiwan has moved beyond the outdated idea that it still belongs to China, and Beijing has likely squandered any hope of peaceful unification. So with diplomacy failing, why does China still cling to its One China principle? And what justifies its relentless pursuit of Taiwan, even at the risk of global backlash and potential war? Beijing's justification rests on four key pillars, each shaping its strategy and resolve. First, there's the notion of unfinished business. To Beijing, Taiwan's annexation is the final chapter of the Chinese Civil War, a necessary step in restoring China's rightful place on the world stage. They frame this as existential, a way to finally erase the humiliation of foreign interference and complete their national destiny. Next are the historical claims. Chinese leaders assert that Taiwan has always been part of China, dating back to ancient times. The PRC presents reunification as not just desirable, but essential to restoring China's historical integrity. Then there's the one people argument. Beijing insists that Taiwanese and Chinese people share the same cultural heritage and identity. From their perspective, separation is unnatural, an aberration that must be corrected through unification. And finally, Beijing claims a legal basis for its stance. The PRC argues that international law recognizes Taiwan as part of China, using past agreements and diplomatic precedents to justify its sovereignty claim. So let's start first with the claim that Taiwan's reunification is essential to officially conclude the Chinese Civil War. The war may have gone cold in 1949, but unlike other frozen conflicts, as in Korea, Taiwan has moved on. The government no longer harbors ambitions of reclaiming the mainland, and more importantly, neither do its people. In fact, under the current Democratic Progressive Party or DPP government, Taiwan would gladly renounce any claims over the Chinese mainland, officially ending the Chinese Civil War once and for all. Yet paradoxically, Beijing won't allow it. Why? Because if Taiwan formally drops its claim to China, it removes Beijing's justification for its own claim over Taiwan. That's why China continues to threaten military action under its anti-secession law, ensuring that the Chinese Civil War technically never ends. This legal ambiguity is what allows Beijing to keep its case for reunification alive. But the reality is clear. Taiwan has outgrown this conflict, while Beijing keeps it alive for its own political ends. The question is, how much longer can this contradiction hold? Alright, let's dive into the claim of historical sovereignty over Taiwan. The People's Republic of China often asserts that aside from a 50-year period of Japanese rule, Taiwan has always been an inseparable part of China since ancient times. But does history support this narrative? In reality, there was no significant Chinese presence neither in governance nor population on the island during ancient times. Instead, Taiwan was home to indigenous peoples, many of whom still form part of the island's population today. It wasn't until the 17th century when the Dutch East India Company established a colony on the island, then known as Formosa, that Hakka Chinese migrants were brought over to help the Dutch cultivate the land and support trading operations. Many of these early Hakka Chinese settlers weren't sent by an imperial decree, but were in fact fleeing oppression from the Chinese imperial government. Their migration wasn't about reinforcing Chinese sovereignty, it was about survival and opportunity under foreign colonial rule. By the late 1600s, the Dutch had lost their grip on Formosa and were driven out by a Chinese pirate warlord called Koxinga, who established his own short-lived kingdom on the island. Eventually, Taiwan was absorbed into the Qing dynasty, but while it was officially under Qing rule, the island remained largely neglected for the next 2 centuries. During this time, Chinese settlers lived with little oversight from the imperial government, establishing autonomous frontier communities, much like the pioneers of the American West. Taiwan was a wild and self-reliant outpost rather than a tightly governed province. Then in 1895 came the Qing dynasty's defeat in the First Sino-Japanese War. As part of their surrender terms, the Qing government ceded Taiwan to Japan, a decision made without the consent of the island's inhabitants. Despite initial resistance from local settlers, Taiwan remained under Japanese rule for the next 50 years. And during this period, Japan imposed sweeping changes, modernizing infrastructure, education, and industry. Taiwanese society was deeply shaped by the Japanese culture, a legacy still evident today from architectural styles and cuisine to aspects of daily life. Then following World War II, the Allies had Japan hand Taiwan over to the Nationalist Republic of China, not the Communist PRC. So historically, the People's Republic of China has never controlled Taiwan. Furthermore, the Qing dynasty's loose 200-year administration hardly substantiates a claim that Taiwan has been intrinsically part of China since ancient times. Fast forward to today, and here's the reality. The PRC has never administered Taiwan, and the island has operated under its own government for over 75 years. So when Beijing claims that Taiwan has always been part of China, the historical record tells a more complicated story. And now on to the one people claim. The PRC argues that mainland Chinese and Taiwanese are essentially the same people, and therefore must be united. Regardless of China's claim, the people of Taiwan see themselves differently. According to a 2023 Pew Research study, the vast majority of Taiwanese identify as Taiwanese first and not Chinese. And while it's true that there are cultural similarities, shared history, language, and traditions, does that justify unification? While the PRC insists on the one people narrative, it ignores the self-identification and wishes of the Taiwanese people, who overwhelmingly see themselves as distinct. Furthermore, Taiwan isn't just culturally different from the mainland in key ways, it's also a vibrant democracy. The people take pride in their freedoms, their elections, and their ability to choose their leaders. something that doesn't exist under Beijing's system. And this brings us to the claim of international law. The PRC often cites international law as a basis for their sovereignty claim over Taiwan, but they fail to specify which law or laws support this. In fact, by ignoring Taiwan's right to self-determination, China violates international law. For example, Beijing is a signatory to Article 1 of the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights, which states that all peoples have the right to self-determination. Then there's Article 1 of the UN Charter, which also emphasizes respect for the principle of self-determination of peoples. Yet China insists Taiwan has no such right, despite its own commitments under international law. And let's not forget Article 2 of the UN Charter, which explicitly prohibits the use of force in international relations and mandates respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity. Therefore, wouldn't threatening Taiwan with military force because its people wish to exercise their own self-determination be a direct violation of these principles? So when Beijing argues that international law supports its claim, we have to ask, where exactly is that written? Because based on the actual text of international law, it seems that China is the one in violation. In light of these points, it's clear that the PRC's justifications for the One China principle struggle to hold up under scrutiny. So what truly motivates China's insistence on enforcing this policy? Is this really about historical claims, about cultural unity, or is it about power, strategic, economic, and political? Let's start with economics. Taiwan isn't just another island, it's a technological powerhouse, home to the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, or TSMC. This one company produces over 90% of the world's most advanced microchips, the very chips that power everything from iPhones to fighter jets. And whoever controls Taiwan controls the future of technology. The US knows this, and so does China. But if China were to take Taiwan, intact with its thriving semiconductor industry, that would give China incredible technological advantage, as it would gain access to the crown jewel of the semiconductor industry. No more restrictions or export controls, China would instantly become a semiconductor superpower. Then there's Taiwan's strategic location. Sitting at the crossroads of major trade routes in the Western Pacific, Taiwan's location makes it a geopolitical prize. If Beijing controls Taiwan, it bypasses the so-called First Island chain of US allies and extends its military reach deep into the Pacific. This alone would be an absolute game changer and alter the balance of power in the Pacific. And finally, there's the political factor. Taiwan is a thriving democracy, a direct counterexample to Beijing's authoritarian model. Every free election in Taiwan, every peaceful transfer of power, undermines the Chinese Communist Party's claim that democracy is incompatible with Chinese culture. The contagion of pro-democracy ideas from Taiwan are a serious threat to Beijing's grip on power, as the communist leadership likely fears that mainland Chinese may look to Taiwan, which has more than double GDP per capita and a higher standard of living than in China, and demand the same freedoms. Beijing's paranoia of losing power is probably why the one country, two systems model failed, and is likely a key reason for Beijing's crackdown on Hong Kong, to stem the contagion of ideas that challenge the Chinese Communist Party's control. Therefore, with Taiwan's proximity and shared language, Beijing likely considers its influence to be too dangerous to go unchecked. But beyond all of this, there's one more reason why Beijing cannot afford to go soft on Taiwan: political survival. For Xi Jinping or any Chinese leader, allowing Taiwan to declare formal independence would be catastrophic. It would shatter the image of a rising, unstoppable China and make Xi look weak, something he simply cannot afford. History shows what happens when authoritarian leaders are seen as weak. The fall of the Soviet Union haunts the Chinese Communist Party to this day, and Xi knows that if he were to lose Taiwan, his political career and perhaps the stability of the CCP itself could be in jeopardy. Therefore, the use of force, once seen as a distant possibility, now looms as a far more likely outcome. And the more China pushes Taiwan, the more Taiwan pushes back, moving ever closer to declaring full independence. This escalating cycle fuels a dangerous feedback loop. China's pressure on Taiwan is meant to deter independence, but in reality it's having the opposite effect, hardening Taiwan's resolve, deepening its democratic identity, and strengthening its ties to its global allies. Academics and policymakers alike argue that Beijing's actions are driven not just by a desire for territorial control, but by a deeper existential need to maintain national unity. As Naval War College professor Sarah Pine aptly put it, the Chinese Communist Party's rule has long been legitimized by a trade-off of relinquishing personal freedoms in exchange for economic growth. But with China's economy stagnating, due in no small part to the government's poor policy decisions, the Communist Party may have to turn to nationalism as a way to bolster its legitimacy. Through this logic, Taiwan becomes a perfect foil, a rallying cry to redirect domestic frustrations outward. So how is Taiwan preparing? The island has increased its defense spending, extended military conscription, and is in the process of altering its military strategy to focus on a strong defense posture. Meanwhile, the international community has been increasingly vocal in its defense of Taiwan, with former President Biden's vow to defend Taiwan if attacked by China. This crisis is no longer just a regional issue, it's a global one. And the question now is not just whether China will act, but whether the world is prepared for what comes next. The United States continues its balancing act, publicly upholding the One China policy while deepening support for Taiwan. But how much longer can this last? Critics such as former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo argue that maintaining the One China policy only emboldens Beijing rather than deters it. Is it preserving stability, or is it an outdated relic that no longer reflects reality? And while Marco Rubio affirms adherence to the One China policy, frustration in Washington is growing. President Trump refused to take a clear stance on the One China policy during a recent press conference. However, the prevalence of China hawks in his cabinet, recent trade deals with Taiwanese businesses, and updates to the State Department's Taiwan fact sheet all indicate a position that is strongly in the favor of defending Taiwan. Trump's administration, like President Xi's, thrives on toughness, meaning a direct challenge to the One China policy to gain leverage in a trade negotiation, for example, may no longer be unthinkable. It's a high-stakes gamble. If Taiwan were to formally declare independence without being attacked, it could forever weaken Beijing's justification for military annexation. But at the same time, China may not even wait for a declaration at all. Xi has already set a deadline for the Chinese military to be ready to invade Taiwan by 2027. Ultimately, it seems that the One China policy is beginning to collapse under its own weight. At some point, someone will have to blink. Will it be Beijing, Washington, or Taipei? As General Mike Minihan, former head of the U.S. Air Mobility Command, honestly put it, "I hope I am wrong, but my gut tells me we will fight in 2025. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and comment below.